Hello, listeners. It's Mallory Wilsey, Chief Producer of the Enrollify Network, and I want to take just a moment to tell you about another show on Enrollify that I know you'll love. Mastering the Next is a cutting-edge podcast exploring the future of graduate, online, and non-traditional education through the lens of technology and artificial intelligence. Staying competitive in the world of graduate student recruitment and enrollment means keeping up with the ever-evolving tech trends in higher ed. Join Dr. Ray Lutsky, VP of Strategic Partnerships at Element 451, as he explores what's next at the dynamic intersection of student recruitment and leading-edge technology. Each episode will explore future trends and the technologies shaping the academic landscape of the 21st century. Listeners will be equipped with strategies to meet the evolving needs of today's online and non-traditional learners. New episodes drop every other Friday, and you can subscribe to the show by visiting podcast.enrollify.org or just search Mastering the Next wherever you get your podcasts.
Hit it! That's what I'm talking about. Wait!
Okay, now, from the beginning.
Hit it, boys.
Welcome to After Further Consideration, a special 5-part DEI-focused pulse check series brought to you by Enrollify and Element 451. I'm Dr. Cody Nielsen, Executive Director of Convergence Strategies, independent scholar, and adjunct faculty throughout the United States.
And I'm Dr. Tamika Ferguson, Assistant Dean for Student Affairs and Inclusive Excellence and Assistant Professor in the School of Education at Virginia Commonwealth University. We're sitting down with seasoned change leaders for candid chats about responsive leadership, addressing campus crises, navigating institutional shifts, and fostering sustainable change, all through the lens of equity and inclusion.
Each episode dives into real-life challenges, lessons learned, and the innovative solutions some of the brightest minds have developed to tackle these complex issues.
Our goal is to help you drive positive and inclusive change in your campus. Now, let's jump into today's episode.
Today, our guest is Dr. Peter Cornish, who is the Director of Counseling and Psychological Services at UC Berkeley in Berkeley, California. Dr. Peter Cornish and I go back several years when I first met him at a conference in Canada and was so grateful to hear and learn about his important work. He's a clinical and research specialist and has, over the last several years, developed and done and performed consultations and facilitations with more than 150 organizations across North America. I remember the time that he called me and told me that he was moving to Berkeley from where he was in Canada and brought alongside his work Step Care 2.0, which is a model, and his organization Step Care Solutions, which is a leading partner of Wellness Together work in Canada. Dr. Peter Cornish, you are an illustrious name in the counseling and psychological services world, and we are so grateful to have you here today with us.
Thank you very much. Well, I can't quite see myself as illustrious, but thank you for the compliment. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, Peter, it's so great to have you. When Tamika and I were given the opportunity to start this series, I immediately thought of your work. And it has been a little while since you and I have had a chance to connect. So I'm really hoping to hear and really catch up through this a little bit about some of the work you've been doing in Berkeley with the counseling services there. But before we get there, I need you to tell our audience the backstory. How did Peter Cornish become Peter Cornish and all of these pieces? So can you tell us a little bit about your story and your sort of career journey into the psychological services and how you just so happened to leave Canada and move to the United States?
Yes, of course. The backstory seems to shift all the time. The more that I learn, the more that I engage with people, the more insight I have into that question, or the answer to that question. And recently I was in Switzerland and I was invited to give a keynote address at a psychiatric congress. And I was really surprised by how many people were telling their own stories, including the psychiatrists and nurse practitioners. There were, of course, people with lived experience there. And I was presenting on day 2, so I got to soak it all in. And I realized I have to start with why am I here and how did I get to be in this line of work? Kind of like the question you just asked. And the first thing that came to mind were my family members and my ancestors. The more that I've learned, the more that I realize how neurodivergent and how many of them have struggled within our healing system and have not done well by virtue of that system. My father is diagnosed with bipolar 1. My sister, after many, many years, diagnosed with schizophrenia, paranoid schizophrenia, had multiple learning disabilities. My uncle, my father's brother, I thought he was mentally delayed, but it was the antipsychotic medication. I only realized long after I was an adult that he had likely been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Both my mother and my brother struggled with substance use. And it just kind of goes on and on. And one of the things that really disappointed me, the more that I'm learning in this field, was how they were all defined by their deficits. And they received treatment for their deficits, but it didn't work very well. And what I've come to see is how wonderful and beautiful all these people were. My father, when he was in his manic phase, was just so much fun. He had his depression, but that wasn't who he was. He was an amazing creative person. My sister has the most common sense. My brother is a skilled carpenter and gifted teacher. And yet what I learned all through my life was to focus on the stigmatizing things, to judge many people in my family. Somehow I got into this field of psychology. My father once answered a friend of his introduced me to a friend of his saying, "This is my son, Peter. He's a psychologist because of me." I thought that was kind of funny. But it's actually true, but not in the way I think he meant. I think he meant that because he struggled so much, I'm going to be a psychologist. But I think more that what I've learned more recently is I'm a psychologist because of all the gifts that these people had. And I've started to change. I've always tried to do things differently because I had a sense that what was happening was not right or working. I wasn't satisfied. I took business for a while and I wasn't satisfied. The end of the lecture was, so what's the bottom line? That didn't seem right. Got to be more than the bottom line involved. Studied psychology, and it was all about clinical trials and evidence that proves one way is right and the other is wrong. And that's missing something. I studied literature and history and philosophy, and I thought, but I think that's got more to do with healing. And yet I couldn't find a way to practice it. So all the way along, many years practicing what I was trained in psychotherapy and clinical psychology didn't seem to capture what was needed. And so I was always looking for something else.
Yeah. Wow. So, Tamika, I know you more than Tamika knows. And so I'm really excited because Tamika and I like to sort of go back and forth on these questions. But when you made that decision, you're Canadian by birth, right? Am I right on that?
Yes. Yep.
So you made a decision, and of course, our audience is going to be largely a higher ed audience, administrators and staff and faculty throughout it. But you made a really concerted decision. I'll never forget when you told me that you were moving from your home in Canada with really good health insurance and healthcare coverage in the Canadian front. And you're like, I'm going to move to Berkeley. And I was like, well, why? You're moving to an extraordinarily expensive place, but obviously a great place to be doing work with college students. And wasn't this this was circa 2018, 2019. This was pre-pandemic. So the world fell apart after you came. But what made you decide to move into that specifically higher ed space?
Well, it was actually right at the beginning. I accepted the job before the pandemic, and I accepted the job before the federal government in Canada invited me to build a pandemic response, an innovative pandemic response. So the question was, well, so I accepted the job at Berkeley, and why did I accept that? Because I had a really strong sense that even though there was lots of interest in this model, there was so much more to learn. And I wanted to learn from a university that has many diverse thinkers in many different departments. I wanted to partner with researchers. The Berkeley Student Mental Health was very well funded, lots of staff. So clearly lots of talent. The government of California was kind of like the government of Canada, wanting to invest in mental health. And I knew some people that were connected with the government. They were saying there's lots coming in California. And then there was Silicon Valley, where I've always thought that technology can be part of the solution. So that really drew me in. Then I got, this work in Canada, which was huge. And people said, well, why are you going? We've got everything here. You've got this, your whole model will be implemented across the country. And I think it was because I said, there was just something I said, I don't have enough answers. Like I need to learn, and we're best to learn than in the university.
Yeah.
So, Peter, one of the things that's of interest to me is there's this thread of your story, both your reason to come back into this higher ed space and also the emphasis that you shared within your narrative about your ancestors and your family, which I just want to say, as you were sharing, my immediate thought was, of course, empathy, right? But also I had to sit with myself a little bit and unpack while you were sharing, because you said something about finding beauty in deficits, right? That's what comes across my mind, finding the beauty and the gifting in folks. And a lot of times, if this is not a lived experience, whether it's us having these individual disabilities or being in a space, a loving space and relationship with people, it's hard to find the beauty. And I think when we're talking to leaders and we're talking to folks who are working with the purpose of being inclusive and the purpose of being equitable, I think the simplicity of finding the beauty in what people see as deficits or a stigma is actually a barrier even for well-meaning individuals. I was wondering if you could maybe talk about how do you assist people with seeing the beauty and moving past the deficit thinking, moving past the stigmas that are attached to disability or even to just challenges that folks may face that are often unseen. How do we see the beauty in people in a way that shifts how we create relationships?
I do it, I think, by demonstration. There's a couple of key moments. One, before I left Canada at Memorial University, when we'd implemented a new approach that gave rapid access, same-day access to care. And a student came in late on a Friday afternoon, and I didn't see that student on Friday afternoon, but she emailed me later and said, I came in on Friday afternoon and the front desk people said, I'm sorry, there's nobody available. It's the end of the day. And she sent me a very angry email. What do you mean there's nobody to see me? You've got a walk-in service. I just wanted to talk to someone. And so my approach was not to get, I don't know why it wasn't, but was not to get defensive. I said, I want to hear you. I want you to come in and talk to me. And I knew that for some reason there was something that she could teach me. We hadn't gotten it right yet. So I invited her in, listened to her, and she said, no one said the same thing. And I said, well, but I've already talked to you about this. Our system, is a walk-in, but at the end of the day, it's the end of the day. And she said, no, you're not hearing me. It's okay. Help me hear you. I wanted anyone to talk to. I said, well, what do you mean? Well, Patricia and Julie are on the front desk. It was very quiet. I could have just talked to them. And so we sat down and said, both Patricia and Julie had mental health first aid training. There was a little room off to the side. Patricia and Julie were not feeling very impactful in their work. And they just loved the idea of, if there's an opportunity just to listen to a student, why don't they put that skill set in place? So that was the curiosity that I brought with this student to say, come on in and help me solve this problem versus I'm going to solve it. And so maybe I learned that from my family, that they have lots of amazing things despite their deficits. And I did something similar at Berkeley. A student who identifies as neurodiverse, brilliant student, has a very prestigious scholarship, complained, wrote to everybody on the spectrum, copied everybody in the universe just about the complaint, and then sent a separate email to me. And I said, come on in and talk. Now he's leading a neurodiversity initiative. He's the chair, and the two original co-chairs are now co-mentors. And this guy just brings a totally different way of thinking. And I could not come up with his way of thinking. And it's it's a lot of fun when you welcome people who you think, or you might assume, don't have anything at the table. They actually have some solutions that we would never think of.
I appreciate that, because you're basically saying we need to be curious about ways that we can not only assist with listening, but also not taking up the space to drive the solution. And I think that that's such a powerful way to approach this work, because when we think about diversity and equity, inclusion, and finding ways for folks to feel valued and belonging, sometimes it's not us telling them. We can't tell someone that we're diverse. We can't tell someone that they're included. We can't tell it. It really has to be felt and experienced. And I think what better way than to create space for their voice. And then what I also enjoy is that you talked about, then take their advice, right? Listen to what they have to say and then enact it so that they feel affirmed.
And, I acknowledge that as a white heterosexual male, I have tremendous power and privilege. So I am very safe. So why can't I just put my ego aside and say, I don't have all the answers? And when I find myself reacting negatively, or someone's trying to tell me something, I need to back off and say, put my ego away, put my defenses away, and teach me something. I realize that's not as easy for someone to do if they don't have that privilege, because they are at risk. So I guess I just figured, if I've got this privilege and I've got this safety, I really should put it to use to invite others in.
Yeah. I appreciate you naming that, because this podcast really does want to apply a sort of DEI lens. And I think it's always important for us to have the reflexivity to sort of understand where we are and the privilege and the power. So I really appreciate you naming it. It's a good modeling for folks. We want to also sort of talk about, there's a lot of changes. Obviously, your work in stepped care, and obviously having Canada modeled across the country, or wanting to build that out with you, demonstrates one of the things about changing significantly around psychological services. There's a longstanding sort of narrative, though, on college campuses that we have a mental health crisis. And what we'd like you to do is, can you discuss some of the ways in which, in this role at Berkeley or in your international work, you've been able to sort of overcome and manage through those crises, some of those key points of transition, and what you have been engaging with to essentially deal with this sort of longstanding crisis?
I mean, I think where I like to start is to say we have some voices that are finally being heard from people that are saying it's not all right the way things are right now. And so it's a symptom of our society that you have people saying, I am having a mental health crisis. It's also typical of a capitalist system that needs to commodify everything and doesn't want to reflect on large structures that are creating crises and oppression, to say there's something in a lot of individuals. So youth are in crisis. There's a mental health crisis. I don't want to diminish that people are unhappy, and that there are many people who are psychotic, and there are people that are struggling with homelessness and addiction, depression, and there's many people at risk of suicide. I don't want to say that is true. The problem is, it's not a mental health crisis. It's a social crisis. It's an economic crisis. It's a climate crisis. It's a spiritual crisis. And, we have lost touch with what's really important in life, which is my, Indigenous colleagues point me in so many good directions, that the land, our environment, we've disconnected from the healing, abundance of healing resources in our land, in our communities. And then spirituality, where did that go? We had scandals in organized religion that kind of shut that down. We have the medicalization of everything, and that somehow, and the commercialization, commodification. So there's lots of money being made off of pharmacological tools and medications for mental illness. There's psychologists, my colleagues, and psychiatrists who, earn good living. And why do we earn a good living? Because we're scarce. So we get paid a lot. And so a scarcity mindset is what is really capitalism is driven by. And we're not going to get rid of capitalism in this country. It's just not going to happen. So I'm not expecting that. But I do think a synergistic model leaves room for different players. So the opposite of a scarcity model is synergy. Synergy means that you can have opposing ideas and forces that, if in balance, kind of like in nature, in balance, they can produce something that's greater than the sum of the parts. So capitalism's great. Let's put it here. Socialism's great. Let's put it here. Let's have a social democracy that has a capitalist engine, but has some welfare, sort of social welfare, universal medicine, thinking beyond what often we think in medical science, which is clinical trials. Let's think about community-defined evidence that comes out of culture from thousands of years old, that we know in this community, this will heal us. And not all of those resources are suitable to be tested through a clinical trial. So clinical trials are great, but let's broaden what we consider to be the resources of healing, and let's look at all our diverse communities to tell us what's healing.
So I appreciate what you shared, because you are right. It is not only a social crisis, but it's a lack of synergy in response to this. And so if we were to think about it, focus more like a higher education space, what are some of your thoughts about how higher education can become a space that we can really tackle the synergistic model that you're proposing?
It's a perfect space. There's no more ideal space. I mean, the only challenge, the only thing, well, it is a big thing that's missing on university campuses. They tend to be elitist, so they don't include everybody. So how to, that's the part that concerns me the most. But putting that aside, and that's a big one, putting it aside for a moment, we have the humanities, we have the creative, we have the fine arts people, we have the philosophers, we have the sociologists, and all of these people on this campus, they're what's going to bring synergy to health and healing. Stop relying on the psychologists and the social workers or the psychiatrists. We need them, but we've overspent on that. And so a campus is a great place to say, let's create synergy. Let's acknowledge all these amazing resources on our campuses and prescribe them instead of just, you must go see a counselor. And so how can we empower our colleagues across campus to use their wisdom to be part of the healing space, as opposed to what we've tended to do is we've taught them to pay attention to signs of risk and symptoms and go see the professional, because otherwise you will be liable and we will be sued and you will be sued. So everybody passes the hot potato, and we have, and on campuses could afford to stand up to the legal teams that might want to sue us. If anyone's going to try and push back on the litigious, risk-aversive nature of our system in this country, it's campuses that can do it. But they have to be bold, because we know what happened at Harvard, and we know what happened at other schools, is that people can be taken down if they're not bold.
Yeah, you're not the first person on this podcast to have a very similar tenor. So I appreciate this. So, Peter, psychological services, on college campuses tends to be this sort of over here in the corner kind of thing. But of course, you came to Berkeley and you were recruited to come to Berkeley in some way, shape, or form through this. And obviously, you're prescribing something that is very different. You're giving guidance. How much do you get to prescribe back to the rest of the campus? Do you get to sit in conversations with other leaders and directors and even senior leadership and try to embody this model outward to the rest of Berkeley?
Yes and no. What I spent my first few years doing was working more internally, because it's sad, but the way that most of us are trained in psychology and other disciplines is extremely narrow. And so I had to work internally to kind of co-design a different way of thinking. I had to change the leadership structure internally. and in ways that were quite radical, including demoting myself so that I could have a co-director and have a horizontal, more matrix type structure. So I needed to do the internal work, because if I didn't have a team of people who trusted, who I earned the trust of, and who shared this, not just a top down, but really across the organization, then it wouldn't matter how much leaders like what I'm doing. So that was job one. And now what I find is the folks across campus, my peers in the academic community, they say, well, how come we haven't done this a long time ago? Duh. So they're easy converts. Students are easy converts. You get in a conversation with them about these ideas of opening up access and including other things. And they go, of course. The bureaucratic credentialing part of the system and the people who are paid to manage risk, they are hard. So for example, I brought my not-for-profit organization with me to Berkeley. And there's an MOU, a partnership, where that organization is doing implementation of this model completely for free. But all the risk people said, oh my God, that can't be, there must be a catch. Or, oh, wait a minute, this conflict of interest. And yes, I declared conflict of interest. I was the founder of this organization. I resigned from all the positions of control, and I still get a consulting fee. Yes, I get a consulting fee, not about the work they're doing at Berkeley, but they could not handle that. And I'm still being investigated for that. So that's the kind of risk aversion that really gets tangled up. Somebody can't believe that synergy is possible. That I remember talking to our legal counsel, and I said, well, it's a confluence of interest. He said, yes, it's true. Often when there's a conflict of interest, there's a confluence of interest. And I said, okay, good. Let's just keep that in mind. But it's hard for people to keep that in mind. The opposites.
Wow.
Yeah, we're both stunned in listening to what you're describing, because synergy is a response, right? And so I'm thinking about the way that you have introduced positioning psychological services and counseling services provided on campuses is not the thing that we send folks to, right? We are actually enveloping it within the entire institutional ecosystem. And so a question that I'm interested in is really building off of what you shared is, what would happen? What would happen if psychological services and counseling services were given more space, authority, and resources to be influential in institutional decision-making? And I frame that through the lens of thinking about the way in which the services are provided are inherently inclusive. Right? We approach this work from doing it from a visible and invisible way in which we serve students and staff and faculty. So what would happen with the appropriate space, the appropriate authority, and the appropriate resources to influence institutional decision-making?
It's a good question. I think giving space is key. I mean, and just trusting that something organic will happen. So I think that would be wise to do. I'm not sure that too many people are going to be interested in opening up and giving that power. I guess the other side of the coin is that, and I speak for myself and some of my colleagues who have said, yes, it's the same for me, is I was never trained how to manage. I was never trained how to lead. I was never trained how to manage up. I was never trained how to do diplomatic relations. I was never trained to be a business person. And our universities are businesses, whether it's not for profit or for profit. There's skills that you have to have in managing people, inspiring people. I was trained as a psychotherapist. That doesn't mean I know how to lead a team, build a team. So I had to do a lot of this learning on my own. And because I've always wanted to learn outside the box, it wasn't that hard for me. I'm not saying I'm an expert on these things, but I'm always interested in learning things that were not in the box I was supposed to learn. So it was a little easier for me to develop those skills. So I think that's part of what is missing, is that we don't have enough diversity in skill sets in our counseling centers. So one of the first things I did here was I hired a project manager. I hired a comms expert. I brought in consultants to coach our management, to develop management skills. I brought in internal folks so that we could all learn to talk business language, not because we're capitalist exploiters. That was the first reaction to many of my colleagues that are angry at our capitalist system, but because we need to be able to learn how economics is part of our solution. So there needs to be a different kind of internal development because I worry that, let's say we were given the stage, I don't think we would manage it well. If we were given the voice at senior leadership, I think we'd have some pretty naive solutions. Well, just be kind to everybody. Just use empathy.
I really appreciate that, because as a faculty member in a leadership program, we talk about this because a lot of times there are a lot of aspirational thinking that is narrow, right? It's based on my experience that serves my context and the things that I influence. But I appreciate you saying that there is the skills development part to be able to contribute effectively when given that power. And to me, that too is inclusive. That too is equitable, because we have to make sure that everyone who's invited to the table with the appropriate level of space and authority and power and even finances, let's name that if they have the appropriate level of preparation and there is a certain commitment to their growth to support them when giving it, I think we'll have less changes to the organizational structure in higher ed so consistently. So I appreciate you just as a leader for naming that, because I think that's a great reflection point that we should all consider.
Yeah, I think of some of the people that report to me, and I in both the organization that I founded and at Berkeley, there's so much skill that needs to be developed to manage differently, to manage in a way that isn't top down, that isn't oppressive. And I don't think anybody's really figured all this out yet. So you have to be constantly ready to fail forward, to notice your mistakes, whether it be a microaggression or whether it be you've sort of fallen into the trap of thinking, oh, this is a diversity hire. Instead of that, thinking, well, here's a Black man that we've hired that has never been told by white people that he needs to develop some skills in some areas because the white people are fragile. And to be able to have a hard conversation, which I didn't do at first I'm thinking of one of my reports, and other people who happen to be white, surprise, surprise, said, one of my colleagues who's a Black woman said, no, this person has no, you have to get that person out. This person has no skills. And I said, well, I think this person might have amazing skills, but no one's ever helped this person to learn and challenge them. So I had to get over my white fragility and just say, I don't think you're doing this right. You gotta do some work.
Yes, fully agreed. You have to do some work. And I appreciate that. And, in that same vein, one of the things in this podcast we're really interested in is really talking about practical application, right? So it's really ingrained within us because we want folks to be able to listen and then also be able to apply or consider applying what we're learning. So could you maybe talk about your work as it relates to like a DEI focused lens and how you apply your work? And that could be a myriad of ways. That can be through your consulting, your leadership as a director, and working with others. But we're interested in how a DEI focused lens shows up in your leadership and how you go about your work.
The first thing that I think is binaries, and how binaries are, again, part of a scarcity paradigm, a win-lose, a left-right, a Republican-Democrat. You're right, I'm wrong, I hate you, I love my own people. And, this is really toxic in identity politics, that I'm right, you're wrong. And so what I think about is decisions are rarely yes or no. I don't make yes or no decisions very often. And some people would say, well, come on, you have to be bold and make them. But sometimes I do, but I always look for the third. So there's yes, no, or there's the third win-win option. So I am convinced that there is something way of having multiple parties get something out of it. And I think successful businesses do that. Sustainable businesses, they say, look, you can win something and I can win something. Businesses that have a good reputation, businesses that aren't too greedy and have a good reputation. And so I think that's the approach that I take is we're at loggerheads. There must be a option C. that we haven't thought of yet.
Yeah. Such an important, I think there's so many little moments in there, Peter. And I know from your work, sort of like breaking past that non-binary and thinking about that sort of third win. One of the big sort of final questions that we always want to ask our guests on this is really thinking about the actionable strategies that you would share with folks. So, bringing your years of this and, your work at, in psychological and counseling services and broadening it to the campus at large, like what kind of actionable strategies would you tell folks working in higher education, working, like adjacent to higher education that you learn from all your years of experiences in this field, like that might really help our audience? Like what kind of things would you tell them to like lean in or to focus in on in terms of those strategies?
I think it's hard to, when you say actionable, it makes me sort of think of people on my team that are better at that than me. I'm more of a sort of big picture visionary idea person. So I'm probably not the best one to answer actionable. I would likely bring somebody in who is more action oriented, and I do, to translate my ideas into action. So I'll just name that is not my forte. Having said that, what I would do is encourage people to be curious, to be, when you're angry, when you're frustrated, what do you do to honor that? Because it's okay. We're human, right? We're going to get frustrated. I'm going to say something that's going to annoy somebody. I'm going to make a mistake. I'm going to insult somebody. I'm going to be the instigator of a microaggression that harms people. And then I have to go through feeling guilty, feeling bad, feeling remorseful. And then how do I get to curiosity? Because curiosity is so much fun and it's so productive. So how do you get yourself to curiosity when you're in difficult places? And maybe, it's difficult for someone to be curious if your basic needs aren't met. And so, but even that, I don't want to make a judgment, because sometimes people who are on the street and you sit down and talk to them and they have very little, actually have a lot to give. So I don't want to go down that binary either. How do you get to curious? The second thing is you need to find some people, everybody like that. And my wife talked to me about this. She said there's some people that have the it factor. And I really didn't know what she was meaning. She started rhyming off a whole bunch of people. They just have a kind of charisma, a way to engage, a way to get people excited. I don't mean entertain people. So you do need people in the organization on your campuses that are going to be able to stand up and say some things that get people thinking. That's pretty rare. So, who is your champion on your campus that you can, if that's not your thing, they can do that for you. That event. I mean, we know that in religion, evangelicalism. We know that in politics. It can be used to divide people, or how do we use it to bring people together? So that's really key, because that's an energy that then, is reproduced and expansive.
Peter, I just want to give you a little bit of a radio announcement. When your wife is talking about some people have the it factor, she's talking about you.
Fully agree. And it's so interesting because I appreciate your framing of curiosity. We use be intellectually curious, be curious about things, but your framing of it, that how do we get people to curiosity, is one I've never thought about. It's not something I've ever spent time, because I naturally assume that curiosity is something that everyone can possess and obtain. But you are absolutely right. If your needs are not being met, do you have the space and the privilege to even be curious? And I think
I won't take credit for that.
Really.
I remember at Memorial University, they had these television screens that promoted different things happening on campus. And the Faculty of Science had the most creative ones. And it simply said, a beautiful image of something scientific, some cell biology. Curiosity is a full-time job. That was their marketing for the Faculty of Science. And I took that and I went, okay, that's my job.
I
I'm
love
gonna
that.
take that too.
Yeah. I also just want to say, for saying that you are a big picture thinker in this sort of big picture and you didn't have a lot of strategies, you gave us 2 strategies and then you gave us a third by subtly reminding us that sometimes the first strategy is knowing your limits and knowing what you're good at and bringing in the right people to help you articulate that.
Yeah.
So, Peter, it is an absolute pleasure to have had you here on the podcast today. I am so grateful for you joining us on After Further Consideration. I know that folks are going to be interested in maybe connecting and learning more about your work. So you can, of course, look at Peter's work around STEP Care Solutions and STEP Care 2.0. You can go look him up and the work that he is doing with the colleagues that we have at UC Berkeley. I should have looked you up when I was on campus in April. I'll find you again when I get back out there this fall. But thank you very much again for being with us today.
You're welcome. Thank you, Cody and Tamika. It was a pleasure.
You're welcome. We appreciate you and all that you're doing to support students and so many others.
This Pulse Check mini-series has been brought to you by Element 451, the next generation AI student engagement platform helping institutions create meaningful and personalized interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com.